Hello, everybody, and welcome to the International Student Experts live interview with our host and interview guest, Tracy.
Hi.
Tracy is a somatic sex educator, and she is here to talk to us about all things to do with sexuality, diversity, different cultural experiences, religious experiences, what to expect in relation to sexuality in Australia and how that might be different in your culture, wherever you come from, wherever you're joining us from. Now, we have a few questions here for Tracy to help your experience in Australia be a better one. However, if you're online with us, please feel free to jot down any questions and we'll try and answer them as we go through the interview. Now, of course, Tracy, this interview will be uploaded into the International Student Experts online orientation course. And if people have got any questions at all, they can contact you on the contact details that we'll provide at the bottom of this chat as well. So, Tracy, thank you for joining us.
You're welcome.
First of all, what can you tell us about culture and sexuality, and why would international students find things very different here in Australia?
It is very, very different in Australia, and of course we've got this whole melting pot of different, of diversity, and there's different cultures, different belief systems, different traditions, all living in this beautiful land together. And education is really, really important because there are so many different belief systems and so many different cultures, and then all of a sudden sexuality in Australia is actually quite open, and we still need more education, but it can be quite confronting for people coming from different lands, and they can find it really quite intimidating, confronting, challenging, very challenging.
So, can you maybe describe some of the differences that people might experience when they come to Australia? So, for example, we have a high number of international students who come from countries in India and China, the African subcontinent as well. We have quite a few students who come from different European countries. I would imagine that there's a lot of differences between each of those countries and cultures as well.
Absolutely. So where do you start? There's I suppose the very first thing you'll see when you come into Australia is our dress. Like, we dress a lot differently to some cultures. So there's a lot more skin exposed in Australia, and that's very, very challenging for some cultures. Then we've got the equality between men and women, and there's some places whereby that equality is different over here. So we need to just be mindful of that. Legalities in Australia are very, very different to the legalities in other countries.
What do you mean by that?
Whereby, taking, for example, somewhere in, say, India, where I think it's actually quite commonplace for a man to practice his marriage rights and demand sex on demand from his wife, whereas in Australia that's not the done thing. So it's a different set of laws completely. So
absolutely. And one of the lessons that we have in the online orientation course in relation to practicing safe sex is all about consent, and I know that you're a big fan of consent and what that means. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Okay, consent is a yes or no. Consent actually goes a lot deeper than just being a yes or a no, but just for these purposes, and in that example that I just gave you, women need to be able to consent, and men. It's not actually a gender thing. For anything, there needs to be consent in Australia, and that's not only for sex, that's for a lot of other things as well. But we cannot take from another person without their being willing. So it's a very, very big topic.
And willingness and consent is not just a verbal yes. There's actually so much more than just someone saying yes, isn't there?
Yes. So body language is only a very small percentage of our verbal language is only a very small percentage of our overall communication between people. I think it's something like 7%, whereas body language has to be congruent with the verbal language in order for full consent, authentic consent, to actually be in place.
Absolutely. And of course, one of the key messages that we convey in the orientation course online for international students is that in Australia, consent is no means no, and if if an international student is engaging in some sort of relationship, sexual or not, and there is no consent, but they force themselves on that other person, it's actually an illegal act.
It's an illegal act.
And in the context of a sexual relationship, if you don't have consent, it could mean that you are charged with rape and go to jail.
And go to jail. And it's very, very important that those laws are actually learned, and that they need that education, I think, to actually put that all in place. So yes, it's a serious crime.
Great. Many international students come here from overseas and they've never been sexually active before. They've never been exposed to the sexual freedoms that we have here in Australia. What can you tell us about what they might see and experience, or how they may feel if they've never been exposed to those sorts of things before?
Well, again,
big question.
That's a massive question. That's okay. That's okay.
Take your time.
Again, it's going to be very challenging and quite intimidating, but also overly exciting. And so I think there's in my experience anyway, certainly, you've got the polar opposites, that people are scared of it and they'll run away from it, and then the others who go full forge ahead. And again, education is the key. To make sure everyone's safe. That's so important. That if you do go into and practice sexual activities, which in Australia is commonplace, it's a lot freer than in a lot of different countries. But to maintain your safety is really important. So
tell us what you mean about safety.
Safety would be condom use.
Yes.
It's for self-preservation, so just to make sure that you're in a physically, emotionally, psychologically safe situation. Condoms, definitely, just to protect from sexually transmitted diseases. Especially if you would be looking at different partners, or certainly if to partner for the first time, you would want to make sure that you're not contracting any STDs. And you'd want to make sure that you're not passing any STDs around to different people. So,
absolutely. And that's one of the key messages that is really commonplace in sex education in Australian schools, isn't it? Mm-hmm. That you don't actually know the sexual background of the people that you're having a sexual relationship with. So it may be that the person that you're with is all reasonable and you think that they're fine and they think they're fine, but you don't know who they've been with 3 or 4 partners before and whether or not they were carrying something as well.
That's right. Yes. So just proceed with caution, I suppose. If anybody's new to Australia and new to the way that the behaviours are different in Australia, just proceed with caution. But I mean, that was physical safety, but emotional, psychological safety as well, to bear that in mind. Because if somebody's come into this country and they've never had any sexual experience or education beforehand, they can be very open to being exploited, and that's something that we'd really like to protect everybody against, really.
Absolutely.
And that's why education is paramount, to learn how to protect yourself in these circumstances where it's just not been an issue before.
And of course, one of the issues that I've found in my experience working in international education is a lot of young women coming over to Australia for the first time, and engaging in sexual activities for the first time, usually unprotected sex, and they find themselves pregnant unexpectedly.
Yes.
And then they're confronted with a whole range of different consequences. Sometimes it can be sexually transmitted infections, sometimes it's pregnancy, and they may come from a country where different options for pregnancy are not available, or it might be shameful to be pregnant before you're married or outside of marriage, which in itself brings a whole other level of education. What can you tell us about international student females who may find themselves pregnant unexpectedly in Australia?
Okay. That obviously does happen. There's lots of help over here. Psychological help, emotional help, physical help. There are terminations are legal over here, and I know that itself brings up a lot of stigma, but there is help and there is support, so nobody ever needs to feel that they are alone in Australia. There's lots of help and support groups to actually navigate that landscape, and also I think if they're going back home as well after that, it'd be really important to maintain some sort of level of community and support in Australia, so that makes that transition a little bit easier going back home. So because the stigma is often associated with unmarried pregnancies or even unmarried sex. So to limit the consequences of that stigma, really, community and professional help is paramount, and it's available in Australia, and I'm quite sure that it would be available to transition.
Yeah, and we've certainly got a range of resources available to help people who find themselves in a situation where they are unexpectedly pregnant.
Absolutely.
Or they do receive unexpectedly sexually transmitted infections.
Absolutely.
What they can do, where they can go for help, and how to identify signs and symptoms and things like that.
Absolutely.
But it's always best to get medical advice in those circumstances anyway.
Yes. So everyone's medical advice and is open to everybody over here. So doctors are quite used to dealing with these sorts of things. Also, the family planning clinics can help with that, and quite often the mental health areas as well will be able to direct in lots of different areas, and they'll just be able to direct you to different support systems.
And overseas student health insurance companies will also have protection and coverage for pregnancies and sexually transmitted diseases and things like that as well. So you may find coverage under your own overseas student health cover as well. Nonetheless, there are a whole range of resources available in the online orientation course, and Tracy as well will be available to guide you in the right direction if that's something that happens for you. I guess one of the things that I come across a lot is particularly girls and women coming from some of the Asian continents coming over here for the first time, and they've never, we would call them sexually immature in the sense that they haven't necessarily had any exposure to sexual relationships before, and so they find themselves in a situation where there may be a young man who expresses interest in them, and suddenly they feel pressured into having sex with them, believing that this man's going to stay around forever. That's something that happens a lot, isn't it?
It does happen a lot, yes, and especially for people who are maybe sexually immature, as you said. This is not always the case, so to be mindful of that in Australia, just because you have sex with somebody doesn't mean to say that you're going to get married and live happily ever after. It doesn't work like that. So and the last thing we need is anybody being exploited. So to be able to get some community support, some community education to learn how that works in Australia, because it's very much different to how it's operating in a lot of those countries, especially Asia. So being open-minded and a little bit cautious when you're entering into any sexual activity that you're not quite sure about. No, if you're not sure about it, back off and maybe go and speak to somebody like me or somebody,
a student support officer at the college or university.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because you certainly don't need to do anything on the spur of the moment, and if you're not sure, just don't go there.
And of course, we have the opposite end of the spectrum as well, where we have international students who come from cultures where having multiple partners is actually encouraged and expected by the community. Mm-hmm. We call them polygamous communities and cultures. Tell us about that in Australia.
Gosh, that's opened up another big conversation there. Yes, so we have lots of different relationship formats, I suppose. They don't necessarily need to be heterosexual man and woman. We have all different. A gay marriage is legal over here. We have all different sexual orientations, representations, and in all different communities. So yes, we have polyamorous relationships, so that's many partners, but that's all consensual and within the contract of the relationship.
Yes.
So many. I'll put a link to the website up and you can maybe go and check out all
Fantastic. The different... And I should have said at the beginning of this interview as well, we've asked Tracy to be giving us just a very brief overview of some of these topics, because we do understand that they are quite confronting for a lot of people and quite controversial in some contexts as well. There are some cultures and religions who do not necessarily like to speak openly and transparently about sexual activity. But as part of our obligation in Australia in helping you to experience a safe and happy journey here, we feel that it's important to give you the very basic information about what sex is like here in Australia and how to be mindful and enjoy your relationships no matter what level they may come on.
Just to be able to navigate your way through.
Absolutely. Navigating relationships is difficult at the best of times.
Yes, but when you're first coming into a new country and it may be completely different to how you are, especially if perhaps you maybe had 3 or 4 wives in one country and you come over here and there's, we have one wife, maybe lots of relationships, but generally one wife. It's a difficult terrain to navigate, but to know that there's people out there that can assist with that and you won't be doing it by yourself.
Fantastic. One of the other things that we hear a lot about, just in terms of vulnerability of female international students in particular, is we find that there are some female international students who find themselves working as escorts and things like that to try and supplement their income and pay their school fees. And we hear sometimes that there are some employers of these escorts who try to scare them into holding on to their visa or dobbing them into the immigration department if they don't work and things like that. But the sex industry in itself in Australia is problematic for female international students in particular. Do you know much about this industry at all and the impact it has on female international students, where they can go for help? Yeah.
So I know about the industry, and for generally international students, they are a little bit more, international people coming over here are generally more likely, if they're going to that industry, more likely to work either on the streets or in parlours or in brothels over here. So, and I think if you look at the figures, they're quite disjointed, and there's a big disparity between immigrants coming over and native-born Australians. So, yes. Sorry, what was the question again about?
The question was really about, do you know much about the sex industry and the exploitation of international students and how they can avoid it, or how they can identify if they must work in those industries, how they can identify good employers versus bad employers, where they can go for help if they feel threatened or stuck in those industries.
Absolutely. So you're still... there may not be workplace agreements in the sex industry or contracts like you've got in any other industry or any other job, but know that your rights are still very important. And if any employer is forcing you to actually forcing you to work, forcing you to stay, taking away your passport, any of that sort of stuff, that is illegal. They cannot do that in Australia. So you have rights on that in that area as well, and to speak up and go and speak to somebody needs to be reported, because your safety is still paramount.
So where would they go if they wanted to report that sort of thing?
Okay, certainly Scarlet Alliance, to go and have a chat and support with them. You can also go to the police and report stuff there as well. Each state is different in Australia, and we all have different rules and regulations, so that can be a little bit confusing in the sex industry. Nothing is cut and dried, but your safety is still paramount. So
absolutely,
yeah, Scarlet Alliance maybe would point you in the right direction.
And while for many international students it may be embarrassing or confronting to approach your own college or student support officers, it may be possible that you can find assistance through various support groups in your community. Certainly there's always the International Student Experts community page and group. We can always take private messages. People like Tracy will also have their contact details available for you at any time. So there is always help and support available, no matter how embarrassed or confronting you may find the topic. One of the other issues I wanted to touch on a little bit more was the issue of abortion, because it is a taboo in many countries, and not just for legal reasons, but for religious and cultural reasons. But we do find a large number of international students who do find themselves in that situation where they do feel that they have to choose to have an abortion. In fact, I was at a conference earlier this week where one of the overseas student health cover providers was saying that in 2018 there were 893 maternity cases lodged by international students, which is just phenomenal, really. They don't clarify whether those pregnancies were deliveries or terminations or what they were, just that there were 893 claims for pregnancy-related services. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about where people could go for abortion help and support if they needed to get not just the physical support, but the emotional support that must accompany something like that.
Yeah. So your first point of call would be the GP and your doctor. So you'd go to see the doctor, and they would actually give you names and addresses of places in each city that would actually look after you on every level in that respect. And yes, to get some psychological support and counselling to actually go through with it, or not, either which way. Because this needs to be a process. It's not something you make your mind up and choose. You need support, and your doctor will be able to, any doctor or the family planning centres. They are highly experienced, but probably the family planning clinic are more highly experienced in this than your average GP. But you can get a referral from there as well, so you'll be able to be looked after emotionally, psychologically, and physically.
And it would be very challenging, I would imagine. I don't expect you to have the answer to this. However, I do imagine it would be very challenging and difficult for international students who are in a situation where they unexpectedly find themselves with a pregnancy and they're unmarried and for religious reasons they feel like they can't have an abortion, but for a whole variety of reasons they feel like they're forced to have an abortion. So it really does raise a lot of cultural and religious issues that are sometimes more challenging and confronting to deal with, a lot more traumatizing than the physical process itself.
Yes, there's a lot there, and it just shows how important education is for people coming over to Australia, because there's just so many new circumstances, new ideas, and everything is so open that that's why education about this sort of stuff will actually reduce those pregnancies, unwanted pregnancies.
So moving on from there then, one of the other issues that we've spoken about is sexually transmitted infections, and how if you're not practicing safe sex with the use of condoms and things like that, you have a higher chance of getting sexually transmitted infections. What are some of the more common sexually transmitted infections that we see in Australia? And how would they know if they might be experiencing them? Another big question.
Sometimes no symptoms whatsoever, so get checked all the time. But some of the more common ones, I suppose, at the moment as well, we've got chlamydia, gonorrhea, HIV is back on the rise again, I heard somewhere. And a lot of these don't have any symptoms at all. Some of them will have discharge from the penis or from the vagina, but a lot don't. So it's best just to go, if you have had unprotected sex at any time, go and see your GP, and they will do a very, very simple test and give you the all clear. That test may need to be backed up in a couple of weeks, depending on, what, if it's a full screen anyway, you might have to go back. But they should do that without judgment and without stigma.
Yeah. And of course, some of those infections that you were talking about can also lead to infertility if they're left untreated.
They can, yes, they can do, especially HPV. And gonorrhea will lead to infertility if you don't get it looked at. So, not something to sit there and be too embarrassed about. There is not as much of a stigma about that in Australia as there are in other countries. So it's in your best interests to go and get it sorted out before it does actually escalate and lead to something else. And it can be very easily treated with a simple course of antibiotics. And
of course, you did mention that HIV is back on the rise, and even though we've got fantastic treatments available for HIV today, I still believe that AIDS is still lethal. Is that true?
They've got amazing medications now where they can actually encapsulate the HIV, so it's actually like in a holding space. It's quarantined within the body, I believe anyway. So, and that's fantastic. We don't see people dying from AIDS these days, which is a massive in Australia here anyway. So, but best prevention is better than anything. So,
and of course, that in itself is actually something that international students in Australia might find quite confronting, or if they're new to Australia and just arriving, you can literally buy condoms anywhere. You can go to the supermarket and find them. You find them at the petrol station when you're getting petrol for your car.
You can get free condoms from the Family Planning Centre. And here in WA we have Magenta, which looks after the sex workers in WA here. You can get free condoms there. There's outreach centres in different in different cities, Melbourne, Sydney. Yeah. So
I
they're
just had a
everywhere.
fantastic idea actually, and I'm sure that for some of these international students, they may not even know how to use condoms properly. I'm sure that there are many Australians who don't know how to use condoms properly. Maybe that's another video for us
Maybe
to
that is
do.
another video. Yes.
Because of course it's not just about opening the packet and putting on a condom. There is a correct way to use them to avoid
Yes.
breakage and thrush and things like that for your partner.
Yeah.
So
and different lubricants as well. You might, if you're using condoms, then it's often an idea to use a good lubricant. And there's things that, some like oils, like coconut oil, you can't use coconut oil with a condom because it will do, it'll break the condom. So there's things like that to know, a good quality lubrication. And yeah, maybe we did do another video.
I
about
think
putting
we
on
will.
condoms.
Please put a thumbs up for the video if you would like us to do another video on how to use condoms effectively to prevent sexually transmitted infections and pregnancy.
And different types of condoms too. So a lot of people have latex allergies, and so there's different brands, there's different types, there's different brands, and they're using different products for manufacture as well because of different allergies. So maybe that's a different video.
Absolutely. One of the things that I did also want to talk to you about was in relation to international students who return to their home country after experiencing the sexual freedoms of Australia. Because we all know that for many international students, they may not get to remain in Australia as permanent residents and citizens, and they do return home. So they will often leave a country where there are limited sexual freedoms. They come and experience all of the liberties that we do have here in Australia, and then they have to go back home to their communities where they're restricted in terms of how they manage their sexuality and how they experience their sexuality, how they navigate that road.
Yes.
Can you talk to us about that again? I think this is going to be a huge question,
it's very
Tracy.
tricky. It's massive.
Please take whatever time you need, because I think this is an important topic too.
It is important, and it's yes, the freedom here, and then to go from here and to try and if you were to do the same sorts of things in those countries, it could be quite dangerous for you in a lot of countries. So support, I think, is paramount to maintain some support from Australia that you can take back with you to your other country. Get some ideas as how to navigate your own sexual urges. You could do that through exercise, through meditation, through breath work, and I can teach you how to do that to a certain extent anyway. And I think to be able to educate the people when you do get back home as well, that's really important, that it is different in Australia, and for you to go from here to back there, you might feel it's really limiting and back into a box. So there's lots of different ideas we can do with self-pleasure and, like I say, breath work, exercise, to be able to just get those sexual urges out that maybe over here wasn't so problematic. And to be able to go back into a culture as well where shame and stigma is associated with sexual freedom, it may be a little bit tricky going back there. So make sure there's loads of support on both sides.
Perhaps some counselling and psychological support through their overseas student healthcare provider before they return home. Bearing in mind, of course, that your overseas student health cover is valid if you're maintaining your student visa conditions for the duration of your student visa and not just for the time of your course. So if you have finished your course and you're expecting that you will be returning to your home country within the month or two after your course is finished, then you still do have the ability to use that overseas student health cover for services such as counselling and things like that to be able to help you navigate your return home.
And I think it's important as well, once people have gone home, that you can still access those services in Australia, either via, I know for me personally anyway, via Skype or FaceTime or
Absolutely.
online
Technology
stuff.
has
Use
opened
technology.
up services so much for
Yeah.
people all around the world,
Yes.
hasn't it?
So the world is really your oyster. So be sure to tap into, to tap into those supports.
Fantastic. I know that this is a topic that you see a lot in your own practice as a sex educator and a sex therapist. And I know that you don't necessarily want to touch on it in great detail here, but I think it's important in the sense that it does assist particularly women and some men in experiencing greater sexual pleasure while they're here in Australia and they're trying to experience or navigate their sexuality, because in some cases that may not always be as pleasurable as what they were hoping. Of course, I'm talking about the area of sexual trauma, and in some cases we have female genital mutilation and male circumcision as well. Male circumcision as well is an area that can lead to trauma sexually, and also I understand the inability to experience sexual pleasure to a certain degree. Can you give us a little bit of an overview of that and some of the things that they might need to be mindful of without sort of going into too much detail? And of course, if they want more information, they can contact you on the contact details that we provide.
Absolutely. So circumcision, female or male, is common in many different countries. Male circumcision is still practiced in Australia. Female circumcision is illegal. So that's very different over here. What is available in Australia is support for, we call it female genital mutilation. So again, different, and that's why it's tricky for us to actually get involved and comment on things that are
outside our own culture.
However, what I will say that there is support in that area as well on education, and also in physically to do I do myself scar remediation, so I do see quite a lot of ladies come through with scarring that's actually removed partial or all of the pleasure zones, and that can be remediated to a certain extent. There's lots of different support systems over here, and I'm quite sure Raylene will put all the details in the bottom. But please don't think that there's nothing that can help you. There's lots, whether it be medical or therapeutic. Please go and see somebody about it, if it's especially if it's causing you
as well.
Hugely, yes.
Yeah. Because for a woman, and sexual trauma is not just in relation to circumcision. There can be sexual trauma in relation to a rape victim, for example, or a domestic violence situation, or even childbirth. Childbirth as well can cause significant trauma sexually for a woman.
Yes.
So it's not just restricted to circumcision in itself. There are so many ways that people experience sexual trauma, or they find sexual activity traumatizing. And so there is assistance for people, whether they're male or female, on a physical level through seeing someone who is called a sexological body worker.
A certified sexological body worker can practice genital scar remediation, and that would be for childbirth, circumcision, gender reassignment, which I haven't spoken here about before.
Please tell us a little bit about
that. Gender reassignment.
Okay.
Okay, so again, as in Australia, very different and very open in that regard. So if somebody actually identifies, a man maybe identifies as a woman and would like to have a gender reassignment surgery, then that is quite commonplace in Australia. So again, different to a lot of different cultures, but it also brings up scarring. So and that's something I do, is scar remediation to soften and realigns the collagen in the skin. So I won't go into it here, but know that it's available. So and that's great, especially if you're having any trauma, as in pain, like painful sex, or uncomfortable sex, then scar remediation will be beneficial.
Absolutely. And of course, any physical therapy would also, I would imagine, be needing emotional therapy as well.
Absolutely. You can't do anything about any physical scars unless you're also addressing the emotional, psychological scarring that's occurred with it. So it's a holistic, or for me anyway, it's a holistic approach. Yeah.
So it was interesting that you touched on an area of sexuality there that not many people in terms of international students would have heard of, being gender reassignment. What are the other types of sexual identities that people could associate with? If for example, they have only ever experienced a heterosexual relationship between a man and a woman, and they're coming from a country overseas where they've never seen anything different other than a man and a woman together, what are some of these labels that we see in Australia?
Gosh, we have lots of different labels, and they're kind of changing and being added to all the time. However, it's commonplace to see two men in a relationship. There might be two women in a relationship. There may be a person who presents as a man but identifies as a woman, or vice versa. They might present as a woman, identify as a man. All different shapes and sizes of relationships. And as we're going along, we're believing that, you know, gender is a human construct, and are we either men or women? We're just people. We're actually just people. So we can all have a relationship with who we want to have a relationship with, and present in whichever way we wish to present.
So I guess for international students watching this video, either coming to Australia for the first time, or they've been in Australia for a little while and they're needing to go through this international student orientation program for their provider, what we're really saying is that there are actually a lot of different sexual identities in Australia. Australia is a very sexually diverse country. And in fact, Australia is a very tolerant country. Very tolerant,
and for the most part, very, very tolerant and very accepting of all different orientations, representations, diversities. Yes, it's very,
fantastic.
Very different.
So, Tracy, is there anything else that you think international students coming to Australia for the first time might need to be aware of, or international students who are already in Australia in relation to their sexuality and just sex education generally?
Generally, yeah.
Do you think that there's anything else that they need to know?
Just ask. There's so much stuff on Google. Find a certified sexological body worker and they'll be able to point you in the right direction. There is no such thing as normal, other than the setting on the tumble dryer. So in Australia, we've got so much freedom here, and education is definitely key. So if there's anything you're not sure about, I'll say ask, because there's lots of people. The help is out there. If you just put your hand up, get onto Google. Find a certified sexological body worker, your doctor, a somatic sex therapist, and
ask away.
Ask us. Put the questions in the comments.
Of course, saying that, to approach somebody that you haven't really met or you're not really close with and asking them questions about their sexuality is not something that we would really encourage. So you wouldn't go up to your next door neighbour, for example, or the student support officer at your college if you didn't necessarily have a good relationship with them and ask them certain questions. There are still certain boundaries that that need to be in place, and there are the right places to go to ask for that sort of help and support and referral for information. And of course, we will put a whole range of resources within the online orientation course around this video, and we will also put in Tracy's contact details. So if you have any questions, she would be more than happy to answer them. She also takes bookings for a range of different services, and you can contact her in relation to those as well. Any last thoughts?
Not that I think of. But this is great. Education is brilliant. Australia is wonderful, a wonderful, wonderful country, and I'm sure they'll have a wonderful time over here.
Actually, I just thought of one more thing. One more thing that I think that international students coming to Australia might need to be aware of is everybody around the world knows Australia for its beautiful beaches. But there are some beaches where it's a little bit different.
It is
Tell
a little
us a
bit
bit
different.
about that.
Yes. So we do have nudist beaches here. So there are designated beaches that you can be nude. You can sunbathe nude, completely nude. That doesn't mean to say you can be sexual on the beaches. It's just the freedom of
removing your
clothing. So sexual activity is still frowned upon on the beaches. They're family friendly, so the children can go to the nudist beach. Yes, and it's not every beach, it's only designated beaches.
So how would they find those beaches? How would they know?
Okay, so your local council will be able to tell you where the local nudist beach is, or again, Google is always a wonderful
And they
resource.
would usually be signposted.
And there's definitely signposted,
So
yes.
they wouldn't accidentally stumble upon a nudist beach, for example.
No, generally you have to go out of your way to find a nudist beach. So don't worry about stumbling on them.
And of
by
course,
accident.
that brings up another topic. Gee, we could sit here all day, couldn't we?
Here all day.
But another topic that I guess is important to raise in relation to beaches in Australia is in Australia, it's quite normal to see men in just board shorts or swimming briefs without a top. And for women, it can often be normal to find them in a one-piece bathing suit or a pair of bikinis. In some cultures, it's actually frowned upon for women to show any skin at all. And they even go swimming fully clothed. So don't be surprised if you attend an Australian beach and you find women who have some one or two piece bathing suits on and others who have no clothing on. But I guess that takes us back to the beginning of our video, doesn't it?
How diverse is Australia? Yes, there's a lot of freedom over here, and we've gone all the way back to the beginning. So how wonderful is that? And we're just this boiling pot of diversity, and you can wear what you like over here.
Fantastic. Tracy, thank you so much for your time. I'm sure that this has been helpful to so many international students coming to Australia for the first time and already being in Australia for a little while. Hopefully it does help them experience Australia in a completely different way. And hopefully it will guide them towards some further resources to assist them in their journey and their experience of Australia if they need help and support. Of course, we will put your details in the video as well so that they can see where they can contact you. And even though you're in Perth, Western Australia, I understand you can see people all over the world as a result of technology.
Isn't technology amazing? Yes. So obviously I can't do any physical body work, but certainly education-wise, there's
But if they did need physical work and
I can refer. Yes,
okay,
I can refer
fantastic.
and work with whoever we've been referred. So there's a way around everything. So
fantastic. Thank you so much for your help
welcome.
again, Tracy, and we look forward to having you back if everybody wants to see that condom video. Thanks very much for watching.
All right.
Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye.